You don't need tutoring to succeed. You can often just study by yourself. But tutoring centres push students way too hard. They push tutors way too hard. Three questions in this speech. Firstly, some setup, then some substantive arguments. Firstly, why this is harmful for students' mental health, and secondly, why they exploit tutors. Firstly, on setup, what is a tutoring college? They probably exist on the spectrum. One end you have things like cram schools, which are quite common in East Asia, which have like 7 p.m. to 12 a.m. tutoring hours, where they often just reteach content. But then also you have perhaps probably more like team and things like tutoring contracts and tutoring companies which subcontract their classes to tutoring centres, which are say more common in nations like Australia. This debate probably doesn't include private tutoring, like one-on-one tutoring, which probably does exist on a range on both how expensive it is, but also on like the experience and all, and maybe yeah. So two arguments then, why this is harmful for students' mental health and why these companies exploit students. On why this is harmful for mental health, there are 4 sub-premises to this argument. The first sub-premise to explain is why students don't opt into these reduced tutoring centres most of the time. There are 4 reasons to this. Firstly, oftentimes these students have they have limited amounts of time, there's so much to balance out. Instead, like East Asia, you often have mandatory clubs that you have to do after school, which take up a lot of time, or even just in life in Australia and in other nations, you have other things that you want to worry about, social time, and trying to get other stuff done. So it's very hard to find the time to fit these things in, oftentimes. The second thing is that these classes also take a lot of energy, and clarification? No. So often, the second thing to say is that these classes often are boring. It's a lot of energy. The classes are just boring. It takes a lot to learn from these things, and it is just a lot to relearn the same content over and over again. And oftentimes, they also last a long period of time. And they are occurring at the end of the day. We've already exhausted your things with a full day of school and other things like club activities. A lot of students just don't have the bother to continue more into the night, and they don't want to continue more into the night. The third thing to say is that a lot of people just don't see the importance and value of these tutoring centres. Maybe this applies more in a Western context than it does apply in an Eastern context. But it still does, that applies to individuals as well. But finally, there's often they feel these classes are constricting. They feel like they have to make a trade-off because they don't think it's something that they value or not what they want to do. So then, that explains why most students don't want to opt in these things. The second premise to explain is why these students are forced against their will into these tutoring centres for 4 reasons. Firstly, parents often just force their children into these centres because they think that these centres will get the best for their student. Because oftentimes there's a lot of chat between parents and they think that's what's going to help them the most. Sometimes they just, or there is just a belief that these things can help. And these centres try to market in that way as well to these parents as well. The second thing to say is that often there exists societal pressures, especially in East Asian societies, that they value education. Because they value education, these individuals feel the pressure to engage in these these tutoring centres without otherwise feeling left out, feeling left behind, or feeling not as intellectually capable as their peers. Thirdly, there's often a societal pressure. That is, the greater these tutoring centres exist on a scale, the more likely that individuals feel the need to opt into these tutoring centres. Because they feel like they're now at a disadvantage because all their peers are getting tutoring when they aren't. And so they feel like they have to opt in because otherwise they lose this advantage. But fourthly and finally, they feel like there's a lot of uni and grade pressure, so they feel like it might be necessary to keep up with the school. The third premise then to explain, given that these students likely don't want to engage in these tutoring centres, is why comparatively these centres don't benefit students. Noting this is preemptive response to most of what we're going to claim, but also explains that if they don't benefit, then it's something that we should ban because it actively harms their mental health. So, 2 reasons why these students don't benefit them. Firstly, these tutoring centres just don't teach right study habits. They often spoon-feed these students about how they just often teach to the test because that's what they think is the most effective thing, which then means that they don't have the habits to be independent. But secondly, the students who are motivated will continue to study otherwise without the existence of these centres. In that they'll just do self-study and they'll try to get materials from the teachers. While those students who are demotivated learn nothing from these centres, aren't engaging in it, and probably won't do much elsewhere. The comparative course that they're likely to explain is that your parents might force you to study or other things like force you into private tutoring. But these 2 things are likely to be comparatively better for 2 reasons. Firstly, there's a more immediate feedback loop between you and your parents, and they're more aware of the suffering that you can go through, thus you can better adapt to make sure that you're in a better mental state. But secondly, these things are a lot less strict and less forced upon each other because it's not an exact classroom environment, and so that means the students were less forced into these circumstances. The fourth and final premise then is to explain why these centres are bad for these students' mental health. Firstly, these centres often provide a lot of competition deliberately. And the idea is that they often reduce individuals to ranking. They try to force students into doing things like study, because that is the best way that they try to motivate students. And that makes individual students feel terrible. They feel worthless and meaningless. They feel like they have to be number one, or their life is not as good. And this was damaging to their future mental health prospects as well, because they could not engage in these, because they felt like they were ones that had to be comparative. They had to draw value from success, and this was devastating to individuals being able to engage in the future. The counterfactual was when people engaged in individual study, even if they did one-on-one private tutoring, they didn't have as much competition to the greater degree, which meant that individuals lost this massive mental harm that was, you should weigh very highly. The second reason to explain is that students are often pushed beyond their limit. They're pushed to take less sleep, their concentration is worn out. The counterfactual then is, again, when you have that feedback loop, when you don't have as much of forced classes, and you can you do this teaching a lot more efficiently, your mental health ends up being better. Before I move on, let's take a closing.
This is not a retrospective debate, so the norms that currently created demand for tutoring will continue to exist. How does your side fulfill this?
Oh yes, no, again, that's why I preempted that with a lot of the analysis to explain, firstly, why tutoring centres are inherently bad, secondly, why there are the counterfactual that likely exist is likely to be better. Because when we explain, that's how we deal with that preemptively. Don't worry, I thought of that as a response, it's a pretty good one. So, the second thing to explain is why these tutoring centres exploit tutors. There are three reasons why they exploit tutors. Firstly, to provide a low cost to students, they have to make sure that they charge their tutors and pay their tutors minimal amounts so they can still make a profit. Secondly, there's often an excess amount of tutors in the market, in that every ex-student is often a potential tutor, and they're also very easy to train up. I used to give them a lesson plan, they just need to teach to that. So it's not a very high-skilled job, which means then that you can justify paying tutors low because you can replace those who drop out. But thirdly, these tutors are just young and inexperienced. They just graduated high school, they're uni students, so they have no clue of their work. The outcomes were twofold. Firstly, these tutors were just underpaid, which is bad because in the comparative when they engage in private tutoring, they can probably earn more money. But secondly, they have such long hours that they have to work to, a lot of unpaid work because they don't know what they should or should not be paid for. They do a lot of marking of tests, which becomes tiring and massive for these individuals. We then avoided that. We don't want these individuals being bad, being harmed, so we prefer to ban these. Proud to go on.
Surprisingly, my mum and dad are both Asian. My mum and dad are also at very similar intelligence levels. However, they had completely different educations. My mum grew up in Australia. She went to a school in Melbourne, she went through year 12, she did all of the normal things, and she felt that it was pretty good. She felt that, she wasn't incredibly stressed, although of course there were stressful points in time. That wasn't, like the thing that characterized her education. My dad, on the other hand, went through school in Korea. Now, his education was incredibly different. Whereas my mum finished school at 3:30, and at 3:30 on the dot, my dad had to go through a system which saw him finish school at 4, have dinner, and then start tutoring at 6 until midnight. He got 4 hours of sleep every night, and at the end, they both got very similar results. They are both of similar intelligences, but one came out a lot worse. That is the thing that tutoring centres do. So, before I begin, firstly, I'd now like to talk about, some clarification. I'd like to talk about the counterfactual. If we ban these private tutoring if we ban these tutoring centres, rather, what actually happens? 2 possibilities. The first possibility is that societal buy-in regarding tutoring falls, right? That is, if everyone is suddenly and immediately unenrolled from these tutoring centres because these tutoring centres no longer exist, it appears that tutoring will revert to an advantage rather than the average, rather than the norm, right? Because if everyone's kicked out and no one is in tutoring anymore, the group mentality would essentially mean that if the people around you, if the parents around you aren't enrolling their child in tutoring because they're not enrolled at that current point in time, you are less likely to. This is the norm in, say, places like South Australia, right? Where I did not see a single tutor for the entirety of high school, neither did my friends, neither did the people at public schools, because it simply was not the norm. Tutoring was an advantage rather than the norm. And so what that means is that basically, if no one is accessing tutoring to the extent that they are, like for example right now, then the advantage is evened out, right? But then let's say that that doesn't happen. The other possibility, and possibly the less charitable one, is private tutoring obviously still exists in a range of prices, in a wide range of mediums. And so what that means is that the tutors who formerly worked at tutoring centres go private, right? So in the very in the smallest case, what we essentially have is that we have the same outcome, where people still do tutoring, but simply in a less predatory environment, right? They aren't the tutors aren't subjected to long hours, they're not underpaid and overworked. And the students aren't subjected to all of the harms that Auguste just told you, right? These are the two possibilities that happen. Both of them are better than what happens under the status quo, because in both cases, you basically just have all the harms that come with, tutoring centres, like the commercialization of just cramming as much info as you can into a student who doesn't build good practices because of it. So, in that regard, I'd like to do a bit of clarification regarding a few things that O brought up, which I thought were just deeply uncomparative. Firstly, who goes to these tutoring centres? They said that it was only disadvantaged students, but I'd like to point out that this is deeply untrue. In most countries where tutoring centres exist, I will be tackling this through, in two branches. In the countries where I guess lots of, where the social norm is tutoring centres, right? Essentially, it means that everyone goes. It's not just disadvantaged students, which means that disadvantaged students don't actually get the benefit that OO wanted to tell you. Because again, if everyone does tutoring, everyone gets raised up to the same level. And so if you're a disadvantaged student, obviously people who are from higher income backgrounds still engage, still have access to the advantage that their environment gives them. So when everyone's raised up by that much, even if you're raised up by that much, you're starting from down here, which obviously means that you don't get the benefit that OO would like to tell you. But in the world where tutoring is not the norm, I'd like to point out that private tutoring still exists in a wide range of forms, prices, and so what that means is that disadvantaged students will still be able to access tutoring, and under the status quo, say in Australia, it's less likely that they would go to tutoring centres as they would go to private tutors if, for example, those private tutors were local, if those private tutors were cheaper, which is the most likely scenario, given that tutoring colleges obviously need to take money off the amount of money that they're paying tutors. So then, what does tutoring actually achieve? They said it brought students up to speed, but again, that is deeply this is just not true, because in countries in the East Asian region, it's not just bringing you up to speed, it's essentially just another part of your education, which means that if if no one does tutoring, then the entire education level, the amount of work that you need to do basically lowers for everyone. And so the biggest thing. Sure.
Yeah. So on one hand, your case claims that tutoring culture dies and no one engages, which cripples the access of disadvantaged students to these services. And on the other, you say, well, private tutors will still exist, in which case the parents who have extraordinarily strong academic incentives are just going to pressure these kids in the exact same way, just within the home environment. Tell us, which is it?
So, it's important to note that obviously there are tutoring centres that exist in different countries. Again, like I told you, for example, there's Australia and Korea, right? In Korea, where it's a social norm, obviously if we take the case at its worst, obviously private tutoring still exists, right? But the problem is that when the pressures that exist within the home are suddenly extended to tutoring centres, these tutoring centres are built on cramming as much info, as much knowledge into these students as you can to a terrible level. And to the extent that these tutors are also underpaid and overworked, it's important to note that when you need to weigh up between private tutoring say happening at home and group tutoring centres, one is quite obviously better than the other, as Auguste told you. And so and then you've already heard about the other world. And so it's important to know tutoring centres, what do they actually provide? It's not help due to a disadvantage in say East Asia, right? Obviously, like if you're disadvantaged in, say, Australia, private tutors are still accessible. No, tutoring centres are symptomatic of the fact that everyone in that society is clamouring for tutoring because of a social norm. And suddenly, when you get rid of these tutoring centres, in one case you might have, like the total amount of, demand for tutoring lowering. In the other scenario, you might have, the overall quality of tutoring and the amount of money spent on tutoring lowering. And so in terms of accessibility, obviously like tutors still exist, people aren't locked out. It's just that centralised education to the commercialised level found in tutoring centres no longer exists. And so OWO is completely uncomparative when they give their case. And so obviously there's an advantage that still exists for rich people, but the scale of the advantage is small. Thank you.
This opening government team is right. People do clamour for tutoring. There is a lot of external pressure for people and their children to enter tutoring. And the reason for that was societally that existed. But also, as Jamima told you, unfortunately in these contexts, school just was not enough for these children. They needed this extra leg up in order to compete with the others. And maybe Auguste himself is able to get by with individual study, but there are hundreds and thousands of students across the world who just cannot. And by abolishing tutoring centres, this opening government team just puts them all down the toilet because they cannot compete, they cannot go to school and do the things they want to do, and they face immense pressures at home. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on students' mental health. Not because this team impacts it particularly well, but because I can just knock it out of this debate in a minute. Then their first claim is just silly, because they provide you 4 reasons why students don't opt into this, but I would like to point out that students opt into nothing. You are a child, you don't opt into being born, you don't opt into going to school. And if you want, yeah, sure, what?
The case relies on people who need the tutoring not getting it now, but we explain that firstly. These are the people who aren't accessing these centres. But secondly, there are so many alternatives that these students can access, which increases the imperative and burden on your case so much.
Yeah, I'll get to that later. It's not relevant now. Okay, second thing, they talk about how students are forced into this against their will and they feel disadvantaged. 2 things here. The first is that the incentives of the parents that they themselves point out are particularly pernicious just do not change. Nathan tries to suggest that buying fails, but it is just unclear to me why that is the case. They do not tell you why it is the case that these interests that are so pernicious and harmful for their children do change. And there are 2 broad impacts to that. The first is just backlash. On the lower end of that might seem particularly bad, but the reason that this harm is particularly damaging to this opening government team is because in contexts like India and like other developing countries, this literally just looks like casteism. It looks like people of lower caste being painted as the reason that your child cannot get tutoring or cannot get things that they got in the status quo. And that was particularly damaging because it affected a disproportionately vulnerable group, and it meant that things like the reservation systems in India, which were made to give these people a leg up, just lost legitimacy. These things were important to the fundamental functioning of the education systems in these contexts, and this team debilitates them and cripples them. Secondly then, but it is unclear to me because this team is oh, but the child will just study at home. But what does that look like? It looks like the parents themselves directly pushing this child. They themselves are more likely to overwork them because they constantly surveil the child. They're always around in the house. And if it was true that this parent wanted this child to succeed educationally, and if it was true that this side is going to abolish tutoring centres, and then if it was also true that this child was going to study at home, they do so under the watchful eye of that parent who wanted you to do these things. They are the ones who are going to overwork you and push you to their brink, not the tutoring centres who see you for an hour or 2. Secondly, they just punish you in more pernicious ways. At the higher end of that scale, that literally looked like beating your child if you're a bad person. At the lower end of that scale, it was still pretty bad. It looked like emotional abuse. It looked like you telling that child that you weren't a good person and that you were letting the family down just because you weren't doing things like studying that were out of your control. Mental health is out of this debate. Now then on learning. And the important piece of framing here is just that their counterfactuals just kind of suck, unfortunately. They are twofold. The first is individual study, and the second is telling that one-on-one still exists. And I think this is where Gus's POI comes in, because on one-on-one study, the problem with this that we flag at LO is just that there are a set of stakeholders who cannot access this in the status quo, because this requires more money than tutoring colleges, substantially more, because it needed a more focused set, like presumably one-on-one tutoring, if it were to still exist, and for this team to access its burden on that being better for tutors or whatever, would require a higher level of capital to get into, and therefore there was a large set of stakeholders who were in the middle class to the poorer classes who were not able to access one-on-one tutoring, but were able to access these tutoring colleges. And that is where the benefits that we give you at Jemima kick in, because these are the types of people and the types of stakeholders who are actually able to learn and who are actually able to get that learning that they so desperately needed. Okay, onto their thing of individual study, and the reason that this is untrue or is unimportant in this debate is twofold. The first is that just unfortunately this is not enough for these children. It is a necessary evil if you ought by the tutoring colleges are an evil from this opening government team, then in those contexts they were a necessary evil for these students to engage in. Because that was the only way in which A, they were able to get on par with their other peers who were doing one-on-one tutoring, or who just had a magnificent understanding of the subject in school and then studied them at home, apparently like Auguste does. But secondly, it also meant that when you were unable to access these, you felt like a worse person, because you saw that people around you, maybe kids who had richer parents than yours, were able to access these tutoring colleges, and therefore you internalized that belief, and when you were in class, you were either two things. A, you were either distracted because you just did not know what was going out and you zoned out, or B, you were demotivated because you saw that people around you understood, no, only two of you, already understood what was going on, but you didn't. That was particularly damaging for your own self-internalization of how you saw yourself. Okay, second thing then, is we can just mitigate inequality, and we think that that is not a large thing in Spain. It's a small sect of inequality. These people are already rich, they exploit the system and society in multiple other ways. But secondly, it is just bad in schools as well. Like in India, teachers favor rich people. You can bribe to get your way in. It is unclear why this is the tipping point to solve inequality in the education system. The last thing then is they talk about why this is not good for them because it doesn't inculcate good study habits. And Auguste rambled about this for a minute. But the problem with this argument is that it is not a problem with tutoring colleges, it's a problem with the education system as a whole. So you ought not weigh it because it also exists on their side. Schools presumably also overload children with this information because tutoring colleges are working with the same information that schools are, so it is unclear why we ought weigh this impact at all when it existed on both sides. The problem with this opening government team is one of symmetry, because they give you problems that existed both with tutoring colleges and with schools as a whole. When that kicked in, you ought buy our stuff where we talk about why this backlash is particularly bad, we talk about why this is particularly good for these students. Vote forward with nuke this opening mark.
One. You know what? Tutoring, good, bad, evil, fuck that, who cares? Should they be banned or not? I don't care. Look, what do I actually care about? Well, what I care about is we get an actual discussion into the values of tutoring and why students who choose not to do tutoring do fundamentally worse than students that do tutoring. What we get here when we ban tutoring colleges is we get a discussion into the reason why our education system is failing the students who do not have the money to access tutoring. What we get is we get more in-depth discussion into that. And we think this is a big value, a big thing that you should actually just care more about. Whether not evil not, who cares? This is why we should care. So, firstly, a quick point to set up. So, if we ban tutoring colleges, obviously that means private tutoring will become the main way of accessing tutoring. What does that mean? Just via economics, we think that means the prices for private tutoring will increase. That means private tutoring will be unaccessible for the majority of the population, except rich people. But we know that rich people were just going to use it anyway. So, we think that this makes tutoring unaccessible for the majority of people. Why is that a good thing, actually? Well, firstly, we think that since rich people since that the majority of the population just aren't able to access this fundamental tool in order to get them out of the middle class, we think that we just get more discussion to this. We get the middle class, we get just the majority of the population, the 90% of the population, suddenly just talking about this. Firstly, we just get news discussion to this. Because fundamentally, this is just a big policy change, right? You know, by just having news discussion into this, we think that the public is just like more informed into like the pros and cons, issues with public school funding, you know, just like why schools are failing students in general. We just hear news anchors talking about this. We think that we just get, you know, people debating this, and we think it's just like an important value, right? But just secondly, because it is just a big policy change, politicians just have to justify this in the first place, right? You know, obviously politicians want to get votes, right? Like, you know, obviously they just want to win elections, right? So like when politicians go up and be like, we're going to ban tutoring colleges, we're going to ban the biggest tool the middle class has in order to get from the middle class out of the working class into the middle class, or the middle class getting into beyond that. If they ban that, just imagine the scandal you hear when you hear Anthony Albanese, the common man, just like, oh yeah, I sent all my children to $200 an hour private tutoring. That's just a big scandal, right? And we think that like that means that will just incentivize politicians to actually just like put more cares into public school funding. And you might argue that, right? Whatever, they just send them to private schools, right? But like, firstly, I'm just like, you know, who cares? We get media discussion on it. But second of all, the reason why private schools do so well is that they do have this extra tutoring classes for students. So guess what? We'll just ban that too as well. Because you know what? No group tutoring ever, whatsoever. Thirdly, we think that the educated, we think that it just gives people something to reason to. Okay, sure. Only.
By your own characterization, people really value tutoring and get angry about it. So why would they engage in good faith discussion rather than just inflammatory rhetoric like we already had?
Well, like instead of like, because you sound like assert that it will like somehow lead into inflammatory explanation. But we think that like inflammatory explanation is just like better than, it's just much more better than like the sort of no discussion that we get right now. And I'll get to that later. So I think finally we just get like the educated will finally just have a reason to care. Right now, public schools are currently just, you know, as we said before, it's like significantly underfunded, not cared about, right? And the reason why they're just not cared about is because the people who go for these public schools, right, are just like, you know, just low value voters, right? You know, and you know, politicians cater much more to them. Or like, you know, they just accept their reality. We think that because if everyone is forced to go through like the same thing, right, that weapon is gone, there's just like more value discussion. And of course the opposition will tell us that it's going to be like inflammatory discussion. But we think that like any amount of discussion is better than the current discussion that we're getting right now. And even if it is inflammatory, I just don't think it will be that inflammatory. Like yeah, people will be angry, but people are angry all the time. People are angry when it comes to the voice and stuff. But like still, we still get like debate about it in general, and we do get educated debate, and we get like political opinions on it, because the news media obviously, you know, want to inform people. They will bring experts onto news to talk about it, or you know, politicians will like hire experts to create policy. So we think that like, you know, good thing. So firstly, what are the impacts of this? Well, firstly, we get actual funding into the education system, because you can't just ban this like, you know, biggest weapon used by the lower classes ever in terms of like class transfer, and then just like not give it an alternative solution to it. We think that like no politician would ever willingly sign up for that, and because no politician will ever willingly sign up for that, we think that like politicians will just suddenly have to care about the public education system, even if they already send their kids to private schools. We think that like it just still diminishes the, you know, the benefits that private schools offers, because you know they still can't send them to tutoring anymore. So we think that like discussion there, and also just like, for example, you know, it diminishes the effectiveness of like selective schools and stuff, and you know, big discussion there. Secondly, we get more hearing from like the Ajit, take one conclusion.
Yeah, so your entire benefit is basically just, people will talk about this law, and maybe that will result in some tangible change that is good. How does that in any way justify the fact we tank literally millions of people's ability to actually...
I'll get to that later. Secondly, the value edge discussion externality. So we get more you know, in-depth discussions for the concerns of teachers. We know that teachers are currently just not being heard because of the reason why is they're just a band-aid fix, right? If the public school system is crap, the kids will just go to tutoring, and therefore their marks will improve. Therefore, we don't need to fix this. Suddenly, if like, you know, if that's not the case anymore, we can't just like throw a solution up to this. That means that like students, you know, politicians starting to care. And then like fourthly, I'll get to, now this is my answer to it. So even if you didn't believe that any of this discussion made any value whatsoever, what we agree is, and I think what everyone agrees, is that tutoring does increase marks for students. So what happens if we just get rid of tutoring for the majority of people? Everyone's marks will just fall, and they might not fall right now, but they will eventually fall, and that means Australia's education system will eventually collapse. Well, not collapse, but like our rankings will just decrease, and we think that creates a big scandal, right? Like, you know, year on year, right, we hear from the media, from the politicians, NAPLAN is falling, NAPLAN is falling, Australia's falling in the science and mathematics results. We think that like, no, that just creates like lots of controversy, right? And we think that because that will happen, and we think it does happen because tutoring does make it better. I'm not gonna fight that. We think that therefore, that gives politicians incentives in the future to actually fund the public school system. And then fifthly, a kind of second extension to this is that less teachers will be stolen from the tutoring centers. We think that tutoring centers currently steal teachers away from the public school system. And the reason why they think that happens is that tutoring centers just generally pay teachers much more than the public school system. So firstly, they just steal it. If we ban that, obviously, we think there's more political pressure from teachers to increase their wages because now they can't get the wage alternatively from someone else. And secondly, we think that the public school education system will be beneficial for students because teachers are not diverting priority away from teaching their private school, their college students, and then their actual students. We think that that gives teachers more priority, which will therefore increase the amount of better public education or increase supply of teachers. Thank you for listening to my speech.
Three extensions from closing opposition. Firstly, a vertical extension explaining why we vastly improve the accessibility of tutoring for the vast majority of people. Secondly, an extension on student well-being, explaining why this better protects children from safety concerns and why they are more likely to have fulfilling friendships and relationships in that kind of sense. And thirdly, an extension on explaining why kids with learning difficulties are uniquely benefited by tutoring college and why that is the students we should care most about in this debate. Let's firstly talk about accessibility, because we feel a vital analytical gap in opening opposition to explain why kids will either just be unable to get help in the first place, or there will be an enormous amount of financial pressure on families in a way that is incredibly coercive and detrimental. The first main thing to discuss here is the cost. And Oral obviously points out this will be inaccessible to families that are not able to pay the amount of money that private tutoring affords. But I don't think it quite overcomes what OG sets up about private tutoring being able to exist on a spectrum, which is not all private tutoring costs $100 an hour. You do have a spectrum of tutors and the amount they're able to charge. And considering that they explain that you are likely to have an influx of tutors, I think there is a large amount of mechanistical work that needs to be done to explain why the cost is likely to be unaffordable when you do ban these tutoring colleges. The first thing to note is just that tutoring centers are able to democratize the cost because you have more streams of income per hour, which is like you're accepting 5 students per hour instead of the 1, which means you're likely to be able to lower the cost. But there are better reasons, I guess, or more unique reasons, I guess, I suppose, why this would likely be true. The second is just that private tutors are obviously able to hike up the price when there is a ban on tutoring colleges, which is like maybe they are inaccessible now, but they are likely to become more inaccessible instead of less when there is a ban on tutoring colleges because they are more in demand, which means you are likely to be able to say, well, I was going to charge $60 an hour, but now there's a private tutoring, like private tutoring colleges are gone, I'm your only option, I'm going to charge $80. The third reason is just that there is far more competition there. You remove all the competition amongst tutoring colleges that means they do have to stay relatively affordable. And that is because they are likely to have differences in price. They need to market themselves and explain why you are the tutoring college out of 10 tutoring colleges in Chatsworth that you want to attend. But also because of the reason that you are able to do things like differentiating the type of ways in which you are able to pay tutoring colleges, which is like some tutoring colleges might require upfront costs. They might allow you to pay lesson by lesson. Others might say we need an upfront cost, we're going to reduce that upfront cost if you have the ability to pay. And that has an enormous amount in making it more accessible to families who otherwise would not be able to, because maybe they have different kinds of streams of income and they are not able to do that. When the markets are more saturated, that means that things need to be cheaper. They need to be cheaper in order to differentiate themselves. But let's provide an additional brand new mechanism to explain why this is less likely to be accessible. And that's just as often lower income families are less able to help their kids in the counterfactual when you're trying to do work at home. That's because firstly, often lower income families are the ones who aren't able to help their kids with homework because they're less likely to have university education or higher education, for the reason that offer higher education tends to lend itself to higher paying jobs, which means you might have to be more likely to be able to afford private tutoring for your kids. However, families that do not have a kind of higher educational background often find it difficult to help with the more complex work their children is being given, which means that they're incredibly unable to help with their kids when they're forced to say go on Khan Academy and need help explaining. In comparison, it's the richer families that have that educational background that were able to do those kind of things. But secondly, we would just say that often it is the lower income families that are forced to do things like work shift work, for example. That means you're unable to see your kids at regular schedules, which means you can't help them with their homework because you're working the night shift and you're literally not there for dinner, and you're not there to be able to do things, and you're not there to be able to help them with their homework after school, which means that it's the richer families that were able to work jobs with more traditional hours, that are able to do things like a 9 to 5 or a 9 to 3 or whatever, that were able to help their kids with those kind of things. And thirdly, we would say there's an enormous amount of parental coercion. Because if you do not believe that parents will not allow their kids to not have tutoring, if you believe that they are likely to want to pressure their kids into doing tutoring in either way, you are now likely, as a parent, likely to put heaps more pressure on the student, because of the reason that you are now paying a lot more money to get this private tutor, so you are putting more pressure on the kid to see more results, for the reason that you now are investing a lot more money. So, this person fills an analytical gap in opening opposition's case, fully defeats OG's counterfactual, explained why it is just terrible for lower income families. Secondly, we win on OG's mental health stuff by providing a unique mechanism that explains why the pressure is likely to increase on these children. But thirdly, we just say it is incredibly important because this is obviously a super inequitable scheme that OG would have you believe is important. And we would say that for those reasons, that extension already should do an enormous amount of work for COs with this debate. The second extension is just on child safety and well-being. Because given that this is not a retrospective debate, nor the creative demand for tutoring colleges will not go away, we would say that tutoring colleges are vastly better for well-being. First reason is just obviously because of child safety. In the most extreme circumstances, obviously, this is operating on a one-on-one environment where you're with a child for extended amounts of time. These are the kinds of people, you might have people filter into this kind of profession when you have exclusively private tutoring. But obviously maybe that is in the more extreme of cases. We would just say in the majority of cases, however, students are often more likely to do things that are kind of detrimental to students' well-being. They likely bully their students in some circumstances or be nasty or unkind to them for the reasons that firstly, there's pressure on the tutors to deliver results for the kids because their parents are now paying a lot more money, which means that tutors are likely to lash out at kids that are not understanding the material because it is their neck of the chopping block when their children aren't able to understand this material. But secondly, you have zero accountability compared to tutoring colleges because you have your own clientele, you aren't reliant on your boss to give you clients, which means that you don't have anyone that you are accountable to, which means that you are far more likely to be able to get away with this kind of bullying for abuse. And thirdly, maybe this seems a little bit extreme, but I would just ask you to think about every time you were in high school and your friends came to you in tears or came to you deeply upset because they felt like they were failing their tutor, because their tutor was bullying them, because they were worried, or maybe even in some circumstances, as happened with my friends when their tutors made a pass at them. And I would say that that is incredibly unacceptable. That is far more high modality harm than anyone in this debate has tried to claim. But secondly, we would just say that tutoring colleges allow you to access friends far more importantly than you do if you are by yourself or you are at a private tutor. The reason that you just don't have anyone your age to talk to, and when you make friends, it firstly vastly improves your emotional well-being, you're far happier, but also means you get better learning outcomes because you're more engaged. Before I go on OJs.
If tutoring centers are, aimed at capturing the most students, doesn't mean that they're aiming at the average students. Meaning that if you're a disadvantaged student, you're not being helped because tutoring centers continue to aim at the average student, meaning you'll still need private tutoring.
No, because the market is incredibly saturated. So if everyone was aiming at the average student as in terms of income, that would mean that or in terms of educational benefits, then that would mean that not everyone who's disadvantaged economically is automatically an average student. You can have disadvantaged students economically that are really, really bright. The point here is that parents can't afford to send their kids to tutoring, not that they don't need it. The impact of that obviously is that we win again on the mental health benefit. We provide a far more high modality way to win that than our opening does. But we would also just say, these are kids, we should care about their ability to have fun and make friendships and make meaningful relationships into the long term. And if they're going to be spending hours upon hours of tutoring, we prefer them to do it in an environment in which it is conducive to fulfilling friendships. The last thing is just to explain why tutoring colleges are uniquely good for kids with learning difficulties. And we would say that this is the most important group of children because they are the most let down by the current education system and does not at all cater to their learning needs. We would say, firstly, you have a different learning environment to home, which is often a huge important factor for kids with learning difficulties and being able to differentiate when they are able to use different parts of their brain. Secondly, you have a diversity of tutoring colleges set up, so you're likely to be able to try and find one that works for your kid and their learning difficulties. You have a different quality of staff, most of them are educationally trained, because tutoring colleges tend to try and differentiate themselves, providing people with educational degrees. Fourthly, you have comparatively less students in school for all of those reasons we're talk about this.
I think a major thing in this debate is the complete absence of public schools in this entire debate. Just the idea that you can make friends and you can make friends better through tutoring colleges is something that's not realistic in this world, considering the fact that most people in Australia go to public schools. And I think there is a unique benefit in trying to make our public education system a better environment than simply just allowing tutoring colleges to continue to exist, to continue to take a continual tax on the middle class just to have an equal opportunity learning as richer people. What I'm going to do is compare the two worlds that my member of government brought out, which is either the poorest of the poor, where even in their world, the poorest of the poor are not going to be able to access those tutoring colleges, because no matter what you want to believe, even the most poorest individuals are not going to be able to afford tutoring colleges, because even 20 an hour is a complete unnecessary tax for these people who simply need food and water on the table. Simply put, this entire focus on private tutoring is 1 minute, is entirely negated by the fact that we should be focusing on having an education system in which we're all able to access and to have quality of education that everyone is able to get. Now, onto some notes just about one-on-one tutoring and why, even though we believe that it continues to exist, we believe that completely removing private colleges will increase, even if you don't believe the discussion about this making a whole discussion within the public about why we need to increase funding for educational systems, but why we think that it would increase the public supply of teachers in which schools are able to actually get more and better educational outcomes for the entire school. Now, consider the fact why private tutors consider colleges over one-on-one tutors right now. They're incentivized to choose schools. They're incentivized to choose colleges because there's a consistent roster. There are consistent amount of groups of students that they're able to come in every week and teach without any sort of rescheduling or any sort of complete damage to their schedules. Now, this is already a current incentive in our world in why private tutors choose to tutoring colleges, which means that when you remove or when we abolish private tutoring colleges, these tutors are not incentivized into one-on-one private tutoring, but they are incentivized into a world in which public schools are able to hire them as contractors, which already exists in a majority of the world where public schools realize that, hey, we don't have teachers, but we have a lot of funding. Where can we find teachers that are not exactly, okay.
Point?
No, thank you. This means that schools are able to hire tutors, contractors, which means they're able to get more competition for teachers and that they are having to continually improve their teaching skills. And they also mean that smaller class sizes just means that classes in education systems overall just get better because they are more accommodating to each individual student. Obviously, if you have a teacher with like 100 more students, it's going to have worse teaching outcomes. And the difference between us and both the opposition benches is that we're arguing for a world in which everyone who enters into our public system are able to get these benefits, and not just simply people who are just not the poorest of the poor, say for the middle class and the upper class, and they're able to afford tutoring centers because it's only a $20 an hour, still a lot. I don't know what about you guys, but still I couldn't get into tutoring colleges because it's too expensive. Simply put, we're trying to cater for the poor, the middle class, and even the rich, as I simply don't want to pay for tutoring. And again, back to our original point, which is this increases discussion points on why the public are going to care more about education funding. Is it obviously, if there leads to a destruction of marks, the public are obviously going to have a huge fuss about it. They obviously are incentivized to increase funding for their schools. There's going to be a lot of political pressure. And so even if you believe that argument doesn't exist, we still think that schools as a whole get better educational outcomes. This entire emphasis on using schools as their main support network is also what will lead to better mental health outcomes. And the fact that, not just the fact that counselors exist more when they get more funding. You know what, sure, close it.
Public education actually gets worse when you ban tutoring colleges because you have the same electoral incentives to invest more in the public schools in high-income areas, but now it is far more difficult to get your kid help when, as CG explains, private tutors hike up the prices of private tutoring.
Didn't you already argue that one-on-one tutoring exists for the richest of the rich, and so they don't get any benefits from public education anyways? That's the whole point we're trying to focus on, is that even for the poorer and the middle class communities, they're able to access these benefits more because there's less political pressure for schools to get more funding from high-income neighborhoods, from like the federal funding and state funding. Like, it's just simply put, we're arguing that the impact on these low SES communities are far greater if we're able to further emphasize using schools as their main support network, and through counselors, through having more connection to teachers, compared to just you're interacting with your tutors, your private tutors, most of them are in their 20s university. They're just obviously going to be able to provide less empathetic help, less emotional support help. And simply put, we believe that having students in a more regulated and more safe environment, and having that be a better funded environment, is simply leads to far better outcomes than having them learn through most of their academic stuff through private tutoring centers. Now, these are all more effective solutions because the entire system of private tutoring is exploitated. Sure.
What do you think is more important in this debate? Our stuff that proves how it's awful for a huge amount of students, or CO's stuff on my child safety for a small group of students?
I believe that think increasing public education as a whole just increases the benefits to access. Isn't that fundamental to this debate? This whole entire exploitative system of private tutoring is built on the failures of the public education system. And no, private tutoring is not bad and fix
Order.
Like, this is the problem, is that we believe that private tutoring centers have the ability to be able to cater to students of low income, even though it costs money to send your students there. It doesn't cost money or pressure from the public on the government to actually invest in the thing that everyone uses, which are public schools. And so it should be the main focus. And you should make friends. In that environment, I would argue, I don't think tutoring centers have bullying, I don't have bullying, initiatives. I think schools have bullying initiatives. They actually do try to constantly make the environment a better place than simply not existing in private colleges, and that's why we're very proud to.
Cool, we good to go? Starting in 3. Teams are correct in this debate that education was important. This was a means by which you could upgrade yourself in society, you could upskill and access higher degrees of class mobility than you otherwise would be able to, and that tutoring at times was an important vessel for doing so. But simultaneously, it's important to acknowledge that within the life of a student itself, education and the experiences associated with it are central to them. They are the primary experiences for a developmental stage in which they are experiencing the world and life more broadly. And it was just not your academic success which would impact you in the future. It was the nature of how those experiences affected you, the way in which they would train you. And that is why things like safety, like things like ensuring that these children were able to be educated in an environment in which they were comfortable, in which they would say, wouldn't just foster a love of learning that probably makes them perform better later, but it's one that actively meant they were able to develop into well-rounded, holistic people, that meant they were able to engage with society effectively. And that is why closing opposition is going to decisively win this debate. I'm going to do a few things in the speech. I'm going to start though with a brief note of closing government, explaining why it's so clearly obvious and going up. Firstly, I'll note a substantial amount of their case is just a knife of characterization. That is giving it opening government incredibly explicitly. Secondly, I will note their benefit is incredibly speculative. Their claim is you get better discourse, never mechanize why it is the case that this discourse is likely to manifest in better outcomes, particularly given the people with the largest degree of social and financial capital who could give greater funding to public schools are the people who can just pay their way out of this problem by affording the best private tutors anyway, which means they're relying on a segment of the population who has had no political capital in the past to change public schools and expect that that is going to be sufficient for them to improve. They never prove that, and I think they have nothing and need to lose the game. What are the 3 reasons then closing opposition give you, which mean you win the debate? Firstly, we explain why this is substantially far more accessible, and we do so in far wider terms in our opening, because we just observed that the nature of the business practice of how these centres run are incredibly cost effective, but also incredibly diverse in terms of the types of people that they operate to, and the fact that it's the most successful that are the ones which are likely to stay around, proving that they are substantially more effective than other kinds of options. Secondly, we're able to explain that student well-being is only able to be guaranteed by a business such as the nature of a tutoring college. Because a private individual behind closed doors who's often teaching students when parents are not around because they are busy working or they have other things to do in their lives, that there is an enormous amount of risk that was placed on that child, and that in the worst instances, that was something that was life-threatening, but even to the extent it wasn't, that could lead to situations that did make this child feel like crap, that did mean they weren't able to engage in education, that parental pressure was often a mechanism by which it was exacerbated even further as these tutors were awful to these kids in the pursuit of seeing results, by which was the way they justified their money. I think at the end of the day, a college system in which there are many students where their attention is spread out, there are far greater degrees of adults who have to have legal qualifications, mean those children were far, far safer. I think those things clearly win the debate, because it demonstrates both on an educational front, an accessibility front, and a well-being front, we are winning on all 3. Let's engage in some weighing then against opening opposition. And I'll note their proof for the singular benefit they have helping kids in need and the cultural minorities overcome the flaws of school is just insufficiently proven in the first place. 4 key reasons we outweigh them. Firstly, there is an enormous analytical gap in their case on why you can't access alternative forms of upskilling for education. Just because you are poorer or because you don't have any connections Doesn't mean you have zero avenue open to you. Opening government, to their credit, identify this when they point out, for example, that often there are private tutors that, for example, approximate to your community or scale in pricing because of the fact they're all catering to different niches. I think though, we're far more able to be able to engage that benefit because we explain the active reasons why the business model of tutoring is so drastically more accessible, which means that we call it their only benefit in this debate, which I think means their case is very little left in its turf on its own. But secondly, although we take on a much higher burden, we don't just explain that tutoring colleges helps kids, we actually explain why they're the best possible environment for these kids to be helped in. They claim they're just as good as other ways. We suggest the professionalization of these environments, the nature of how you have far higher degrees of accountability, the fact that they are prioritized based in because of the oversaturation market, the most successful tutoring colleges are the ones that are only going to be alive if you're bad educating students just go under and not in business anymore, means that it's a far better mechanism by which to educationally upskill than other clients, proving their benefit on a scale and on a higher level. Thirdly, we just crack this debate open, because we're not cringe and try and wash out student well-being like a cuck. We actually engage and win on this debate, because we're able to explain specifically why, if you cared about student well-being, maybe the environment of a tutoring centre was harsh, but it was one fundamentally far safer for the child, one in which they could find solidarity with their peers, etc. They could not do so under government bench. Finally though, we just don't know how the ban in colleges specifically actually makes private tutoring way worse, something they don't explain. We point out private tutors just escalate their prices far more in a world in which ban tutoring colleges. That there's far less stringency on those tutors because of the fact that there's no other avenue for which to turn to, that those at the fact that just online resources are probably going to drop in terms of accessibility. All of those things mean the ban doesn't just get rid of a good thing, it makes all the other options you have available to worse. I think that explains clearly why we get those opening government. Three things then in the rest of the speech. Firstly, the government counterfactual, secondly, academic success, and finally, well-being of students. Firstly, on the counterfactual, I'll note here, Gov just kind of wants to have their cake and eat it too, because they want to avoid the harms of tutoring culture that was still, but say that, oh, well, these private tutors will still exist if you need help, which nice they benefit both ways, because they clearly can't have both. First claim they make is that societal buy-in in tutoring centres falls, so people won't pick up tutoring anymore. One, I'd argue demand is pretty high right now, it probably takes a while for that to dissipate. But secondly, this is a clear misidentification of why people value tutoring. It's not, oh, other people do it, so I should do it. It's other people are doing this because they see value in it. That instills the idea, this is value, because it's a way by which I can meaningfully upskill my child so they can move up in society, show a good future for themselves, which all parents care about. Yes?
Students don't want to abuse their students. They have to be in empathy, it's legal, there's a feedback loop mechanism, and parents will probably...
One, plenty don't, but secondly, as we observe very specifically, if you are someone who has that tendency to do that, you're most likely to choose an environment that is uncensored, where there is less authority over you, and importantly, where there is far less accountability for a centre. So maybe it's true that most tutors wouldn't, we're not saying all do, but the people who do have that tendency are most likely to engage in that venue, and there's far less ability to filter those people out when you ban these kinds of centres, and there are no safe alternatives. Second thing they claim is that, well, there's diverse pricing of tutoring. But two, we explain one, this has a massively higher risk. In our second extension, which is the child themselves, firstly, the absence of colleges actually drives this pricing up because there's no alternative now, which individuals who are like, greedy want money like to do. Hell, tutoring colleges think this, I would charge a huge amount of money for this. So I don't claim this like, CGs like they'll get good discourse. I have responded to this. They haven't proven they actually do. Let's then turn to the question of academic success. I'll note here, opening government's claim here isn't that other mechanisms are better than private tutoring in terms of educational outcome. They just claim they're the same, which means all the reasons we give you in extension, that they're more professional, that these centres are more accountable, that they're safer, that you engage in sociable environments of other children through private tutoring, which makes it more bearable and makes it more fun, are all independent reasons why you overcome that benefit substantially. The second claim they make under this is like, oh, well, many students go, not just disadvantaged students. But I would note, benefits to any student who goes through a tutoring college in terms of getting more education outcome is something that helps them succeed in the long run. The point your parents are pressuring into this was a question of where did you want them to go. We thought we should choose the option that was safer, was more effective, and they ultimately would yield far better results.
Thank you all very much for the debate. We'll do general feedback, the result, and the reasons for the result. In general feedback, first thing I'd note is China was bandied around a few times in this debate, but to my understanding, China banned private tutoring colleges last year. So that could have been a cool area of debate to like, why did they do that? What are the consequences of that been? Has it led to OO's conception of the debate? Was it a good idea from OG? I think that could have been an interesting area of the debate to look at, because they just banned it because it's just for how much pressure the kids were under. The second piece of general feedback, I think, is just teams at times opted for some strange characterizations of private tutoring. This I think will become clear in individual feedback later on. But I think there's a lot more opportunities to take far more favourable characterisation, particularly from the government bench, I think, in this debate, of making private tutoring out to tutoring colleges, sorry, give me more specific, tutoring colleges to be really a lot more evil and a lot bad, a lot worse in the way that government describes them. So being particularly financially expensive, cutting kids out, I think a lot more of the equality analysis could have come in there. And that's a strategic choice to make in the debate that the teams took, but I think there could have been a bit more done to try and characterise these colleges and how we think they operate. I think the last thing is there are times in today's debate where I think there's good engagement on issues, but teams aren't necessarily connecting the dots that X issue responds to Y issue. A little bit more of that, particularly at World, is going to help you with judges follow along what clashes with what, particularly in implicit rebuttal. Just making it as simple as possible for judges is good. Otherwise, I think the general stuff, any more if you want to come out individually. In terms of the result then, we came to a contested decision in the end, with the first going to closing opposition. The 2 and 3 was the closest split in the debate, with the 2 ultimately going to opening opposition and the 3 going to opening government. Sorry, Auguste. And the 4th going to closing government. Sorry. I was apologising to Auguste. Yeah, sorry, I think I felt I was owed that one after the debate. Let's go through the results then, and the reasons for the results. Let's start with the CEO extension and how that plays into the debate. The first one they make around accessibility, identifying a bunch of reasons why. On the comparative, it is far better, like it's more accessible to have private tutoring colleges versus comparatives of what presumably look like individual private tutors. That being cost, that being the the demand for private tutoring going up, competition, and then the lower income families, parents can't be able to help with homework, etc. Identifying a bunch of reasons why these colleges are likely to be better. I think that becomes particularly important when looking at the closing half, when looking at the opening half, where we've agreed there's likely to be a huge amount of demand for this on both sides of people want it. Given that context of demanding this, if that stays inelastic on both sides, CEO is able to use that first plenty of extension to explain why this is the most preferred way to do that, which I think tackles a bit of the OG case in terms of why this is actually something that's accessible to lots of people and people benefit from it. But I think secondly, it also goes a lot deeper than opening opposition on why this is a preferable, more accessible form for people to get to than the alternatives. The second thing then on well-being, about how private tutors have more of a capacity to do riskier and dodgier stuff because of the one-on-one nature versus a college system where you've got rules, regulations, more people around you, and then also the more soft, like you have more friends and accessibility to contacts around you. I think at times some of this is maybe a small group of people impacted by it, but I think the risk is still big across everyone, and when those risks do go wrong, is quite a significant risk. So I think they present why that is a more preferable outcome to it. I think what will also become clear when I discuss the top half is there's a bit of a stalemate on mental health and well-being in the top half, where it just kind of seems like it's going to be bad on both sides at the end of it. I'll explain why that is later. So given that stalemate in the top half, I think the well-being mental health contribution that CEO makes is a far more clearer one that we can, is exclusive to one side versus the other in terms of the private tutoring versus the tutoring colleges. There are a couple of POI responses that are given to this, one being that the one about scale of those impacts. I think given opening government, as I've said, maybe it's less kids but huger impact, and also a clearer impact versus top half. The other response is given from GovWhip about the tutoring colleges have policy, the presence of policies, but not tutoring colleges have policies. I agree probably schools are the most likely to have the policies, but I still think that tutoring colleges are more likely to have those policies than what private tutors are. So I think there's better off in the tutoring college environment on the well-being. So I think on those 2 points, they're able to, I guess, solve most of the questions of the debate pretty comprehensively and explain why this is a more preferable system for helping people. Accessibility unlocks all the benefits around academic success, well-being, fixes the mental health issues. The last extension they give us, or at least they preview to us, is this idea about kids with learning difficulties. We like where this was going, just taking enough time in the debate to grade it fully, but we're able to get up successfully on the first 2 questions of the debate. Let's then look at the top half of the debate and how that unfolds. I think there are 3 broad clashes in the top half. I'll start with the least important one that's easiest to solve, and that is what is the experience like for tutors. If I put my note on my feedback hat on for a second, step out of the decision, I thought it was a strange take from opening government to be like, they actually pay these tutors like crap to keep the costs low. It's really cheap. I possibly think it's more strategic take to be like it's really expensive, hard to get into, exacerbate the inequality benefits. But but that wasn't the claim that was made. The claim was made that it was likely to be cheaper and they make the tutors get paid less. So putting decision hat back on, I think the responses we get from OO, I think particularly from Opley, it's just like maybe they don't get paid that great, but the comparative is getting paid worse or having worse conditions, like working at Macca's, etc., than being able to hang out with kids and help students achieve things. Not a big deal of like importance made out of this issue from both teams in the debate, but I think OO provides enough response to say could be worse, and we'd rather have this than that. So I think tutors are better off on side OO having this. The second question then is around academic success. This was, I think, quite an interesting question. I liked where this question was going, given the quite useful stuff from opening half where they tried to just get out of the Sydney coaching market and talk about China, talk about India and that sort of stuff, which I think was quite a good way to take the debate. Well, I was chatting to the Ad School and they're like, no, this is just a Sydney debate. Like, don't worry about going overseas as a program, talk about Sydney. I'm glad you guys didn't. It is a pre-world season comp. So what I think was useful, but what ends up happening in this issue, I think the opening opposition makes a bunch of reasonable claims about why school is likely to be bad for a bunch of kids, both structurally that some areas of education are set up to rely on this private teaching to implement things, but also in lots of cases there are reasons why you might not teach to the test because of curriculum. These tutoring companies do that. Why kids just might need that extra bit of help because they're not getting it in school, they're not getting the attention, smaller classes, capacity to do that in tutoring colleges, means that for a lot of kids they get a significant degree of benefit on this. I don't think that, and the response we get from opening government I think needs a lot more explanation in today's debate. There's hints of like, well, there's stuff on YouTube that's accessible, a back and forth about whether a YouTube channel is a tutoring college or not. I don't know enough about it to weigh in on that particular example, but so I think what OG is able to suggest is that maybe there are resources out there, but the capacity to understand them, to use them well, and to gain the benefits of them, I think OO is able to say are better when you're done in an academic environment. This actually then comes secondly more though to a question of whether or not how much access you get to those additional academic success and what students sort of get through this. Opening government makes the concession I said earlier that they think these costs are low, so they want to make it more accessible to parents, and that's why tutors are paid badly, which therefore means that quite a lot of people do get access to this, and I think then that actually builds into OO's material then that there's actually a big benefit to lots of kids if lots of kids are accessing this, rather than being exclusive upper echelon benefits. I think there are lots of kids that are able to benefit academically off this. That then has to be weighed against the third clash in this top half, which I think possibly at times is the most important clash, that being around the mental well-being of students. And it's where I think OG's strongest material is, where they explain a lot of reasons why tutoring colleges are likely to have a lot of really bad health outcomes on students in terms of pressure and stress that's applied to them going forward. And a bit of back and forth about whether or not kids can consent to this. I probably think it's fair, they probably can't consent, but they're going there anyway. So let's just have the debate about whether or not what their mental health success is like when they are there. I think, so what, the harms are proven. I think they're proven particularly in the most extreme examples, like where the tutoring culture is culturally ingrained, and we hear examples of that, China, India, Korea, etc. What they do instead then, I think, is they end up going private in a lot of cases, and the reason OO gives to that is that we're buying into a culture where this doesn't change. So we change this mechanism, we don't change the culture. Lots of people still maintain the private tutoring, which ends up having, I think, very similar levels of stress and mental health for the majority of students. There is the response, I think this was clever, but needed a lot more work from OG, that once we abolish this, that starts a culture shift. I'm willing to believe this starts a culture shift in some communities, perhaps where the education isn't valued as highly, also the private colleges aren't valued as highly, or it isn't as culturally ingrained. But it's not clear just how that changes the most ingrained environments, where the most extreme version of the mental health arguments that talked about actively occur. So I think when we're looking at that context, I don't think a significant amount of change actually occurs here, and given then that there's also likely to be some other harms that occur to students about extra pressure from parents potentially abusing kids and not doing well, pressure on them, probably means at the top half there's maybe a change somewhat in the mental health stress for some students in some areas, but overall likely to be very little change in the culture, therefore very little change in mental health arguments. So all we're left with the top half then is a clear academic benefit that OO presents, and that's why they're able to get up on that issue versus opening government. Let's bring in closing government now and why they get the fourth in today's debate. Look, I have a lot of sympathy for the case of like the private school kid never had access or didn't know what private tutoring was, and why we must be prioritising public education versus a private tutoring. Anything to make that discussion good is a good thing. However, I don't think it quite works in this debate for a couple of reasons. I think, as pointed out in the POI and the short cross, it's just like the quality of that discussion we're getting is really up in arms, which I think points to the central issue of the CG extension, because we have to believe this is the best way, the only way to do it, and or the best way to gain this discussion, and that discussion will be good and get to the good outcomes we want. I don't think any of those subsequent questions are fully proven by closing comment today's debate. I'm willing to believe this would cause a pretty big discussion in the public, but none of those secondary steps are guaranteed and could possibly end up being worse, as pointed out by POIs and responses around favouring the rich public schools in rich areas that already have that political capital and already have that buy-in. So I think on the big push around the discourse, it isn't really able to stand up, and is, I think, probably less important than given compared to the mental health stuff that opening government talks about. The second stuff on like the school system ultimately collapses. I mean, maybe probably need a bit more work about why the school system collapses, but also is it justified to have all those kids suffer just to achieve that outcome? And then the last extension we get from CG is the idea that private coaching is stealing all the teachers. On the one hand, this is I don't think it's a knife, but it does stand a little bit in contradiction to the idea that tutors are paid poorly by opening governments. It needs to prove that they are paid worse in teaching than they are in a chronically underpaid tutoring characterization that OG gives us. But I'm also just not sure if it is true generally. I think more need to be given as to why there's likely to be such a flood to private tutoring versus like private schools or any other workplace overall. So we're not ultimately walking away convinced this is a massive, singular or important cause of the teacher shortage in Australia overall. So I think though on those three extensions, they're unable to stand up versus the rest of the debate. All right, hope that all made sense. Thank you all very much for the debate. Have a wonderful night. If you want feedback, come let us know.